Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and this is everything you need to know before watching Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes releasing May 10th. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. Back in 1968, around 56 years ago, film audiences were introduced to the Planet of the Apes story for the first time in a film based on the 1963 French novel La Planète des Singes, written by Pierre Boulle, and which would go on to be one of the most successful films of its time, praised by critics and audiences alike. The film was then quickly followed by 4 more theatrical installments, releasing in consecutive years between 1970 and 1973, before the franchise was put on a 25-year pause until the release of its first reboot in 2001, which, despite making a bunch of money at the box office, wasn't particularly well liked, specifically by those who made it, and so fans had to wait another 10 years for yet another reboot, beginning with The Rise of the Planet of the Apes, released in 2011. Fortunately, this film was very well received, as were the next 2 installments, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, released in 2014, and War for the Planet of the Apes, released in 2017. But despite it appearing this series would end off with this trilogy, the franchise will be returning to the big screen once again on May 10th with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, taking place 300 years after the previous film. Despite the significant time jump though, we feel it'll be useful to know what took place throughout the 2011, 2014, and 2017 films ahead of viewing the new one. So we'll be taking a look back at said films to recap everything you may need to know. To begin, we're taken back to the year 2008 and into the West African jungle, as a group of chimpanzees are suddenly ambushed and captured by poachers, before being subsequently shipped for experimental research to Genesis Laboratories, a biotechnology company based in San Francisco. Shortly following their arrival, the chimps are each given a drug codenamed ALZ-112, developed over the course of 5.5 years by geneticist Dr. Will Rodman as a potential cure for Alzheimer's disease that allows the brain to create its own cells in order to repair itself. In addition, the drug appears to also genetically enhance the brain's cells, as seen through chimp number 9. Also nicknamed Bright Eyes after the scientists noticed her irises exhibiting flecks of green following the injection, and whose intelligence is shown to have increased considerably through her successfully completing the Lucas Tower in just 20 moves, 5 moves shy of a perfect score of 15. This display of her brilliance shocks and excites Will, who immediately rushes to meet with the head of Genesis, Stephen Jacobs, to request they begin human trials, but Jacobs says in order to do that, he'll first need approval from the board. So the following day, Will holds a presentation for the board of directors to explain the health and financial benefits of the drug, as well as showcase Bright Eye's capabilities. Things don't go at all as planned though, as when chimp handlers Donnie Thompson and Robert Franklin attempt to prepare Bright Eyes for the meeting, she shockingly attacks Donnie, nearly breaking his arm, before bursting out of her cage and running all throughout the building in an attempt to get away from them, eventually leading to her crashing into the conference room where she's promptly and suddenly shot and killed by the building security, much to Will's dismay. In the aftermath of Bright Eye's death, Jacobs decides to shut the project down, believing no one will ever invest another dime after what took place, and he also orders them to euthanize the remaining chimps, which Robert Franklin reluctantly takes care of, although after putting them down, he finds within Bright Eye's cage a newborn chimp, hence why she'd acted out earlier, as she just wanted to protect her baby, and Franklin, refusing to put the baby down as well, asks Will to take it home with him until he can find a sanctuary, and Will reluctantly agrees. Once home, we see that this project to cure Alzheimer's is actually quite personal for Will, as his father Charles suffers from the disease, but it unfortunately seems now, with the operation shut down, that he'll never be able to help him. The baby chimp's presence, though, appears to have a positive effect on Charles, who quickly grows a liking to him, as does Will, and the two also soon notice that the chimp, who they name Caesar, is much smarter than the average ape, and the green flecks in his irises give Will hope that he may still be able to complete his cure. We then jump 3 years later to 2011, as Will records a breakdown of Caesar's progress, revealing that, by 18 months old, he'd learned how to sign up to 24 words, was completing puzzles and models designed for children ages 8 and up at 2 years old, and by age 3, was showing cognitive skills that far exceed that of a human counterpart, in addition to completing the Lucas Tower in 15 moves, bringing Will to the conclusion that the green in his eyes indicates that the ALZ-112 was passed genetically from mother to son, and that in the absence of damaged cells that need replacing, the drug in his system has radically boosted healthy brain functioning. As Caesar's continued on a positive progression though, Charles' mind has continued to deteriorate, with his nurse proposing that he be taken to an assisted living facility, which leads Will in a last-ditch effort to steal a few vials of the drug from Jen's sis and give his father an injection of it that night, which thankfully works as Charles awakens the next day completely free of the disease. With his mind restored, Charles immediately asks to see Caesar, but when they head up to the attic to get him, he's nowhere to be found, as he, after seeing the neighbor's kids playing outside, decided to sneak out in hopes of joining them, although he instead just ended up scaring the kids, leading their father, Douglas Hunsaker, to swing at Caesar with a bat until Will and Charles arrive, who managed to stop him before he can inflict any harm. During the attack though, Caesar had cut his leg on Doug's fence, so Will sneaks him into the San Francisco Zoo to be patched up by veterinarian Caroline Arana, who soon also becomes a romantic partner of Will's, and with whom Will and his father take Caesar out into the redwoods for the first time. As the years go on and Caesar grows older though, he begins to question his place in the world and where he really came from. So 5 years later in 2016, Will finally brings Caesar to the Genesis headquarters where he was born and reveals his origins to him, as well as Caroline, for the first time, stunning them both. And once back home, Caroline confronts Will about all of this, questioning whether this life is really what Caesar wants, but Will insists he's happy living alongside him and his father, and that them sticking together will help him continue his research on the ALZ-112 and save lives. Sadly though, these plans are suddenly put on hold not too much later, as Will notices his father showing symptoms of Alzheimer's once again, and deduces that the antibodies in his system have found a way to fight the 112 virus so that it can't deliver its therapy, causing his health to begin deteriorating once again, and leading to him one day while Will's at work, wandering out the house and attempting to drive a car parked outside that's revealed to be Douglas Hunsaker's, which he immediately crashes, prompting Doug to drag him out of the car and berate him, all of which is seen by Caesar through the attic window, and leads him to suddenly attack Doug, shockingly biting off his finger before being called off by Charles. As a result of Caesar's vicious attack, he's forced by court order to be taken from their home and sent to the San Bruno primate shelter, run by John Landon, which initially appears to be a relatively nice place, but following Will and Caroline's exit, Caesar's locked up in a cage by the owner's son Dodge, alongside all the other apes, all of whom Dodge routinely abuses, although Caesar suffers the most. In addition, Caesar also finds himself at odds with the other apes, specifically the group's alpha, Rocket, who suddenly attacks him while in the play area and only fails to kill him thanks to a tranquilizer dart fired by Dodge. It's not all completely bad though, as he does soon find a friend in the form of a former circus orangutan named Maurice, who also knows how to communicate through sign language. Back at the Rodman home, we see Charles has continued to get worse and worse, so Will begins developing a more aggressive strain of the virus labeled ALZ-113, as well as reveals everything that's happened with his father to Jacobs in hopes that he'll fund the project once again. And after Will reveals that the ALZ-112 not only helped his father recover, but caused an increase in intelligence as well, Jacobs has him begin testing his revised 112 on chimps immediately. Of the chimps brought to Genesis for the project is Koba, a bonobo who'd suffered years of abuse as a subject of human experiments, but proves to be incredibly intelligent, and so is chosen as their first test subject. During this test to inject the ALZ-113 into his system through an anesthetic machine though, Koba attempts to break free of his restraints, knocking off Robert Franklin's gas mask in the process, but he quickly manages to put it back on, while the other doctors strap Koba back in and complete the process. As they hoped, the virus successfully increases Koba's intelligence with no adverse effects, and these results lead Will to secretly take a few canisters of the virus home with him to be administered to his father. Sometime later, Will also finally pays Caesar his first visit, giving Caesar the impression that he may be returning home soon, but his hopes are shattered when Will informs him that it's not yet time, prompting him to cry and howl at Will out of frustration and anger, which is compounded that night when Dodge decides to bring a few of his friends into the cage area, one of whom Caesar notices is holding a pocket knife. So he grabs hold of him as he inches near his cage and covertly steals the knife. Rather than using it to escape the facility though, Caesar instead uses it to return to the play area, where they're also holding a giant gorilla named Buck in his own isolated cage that Caesar promptly releases him from, gaining the gorilla's respect and friendship in the process before Caesar then decides to lure Rocket into the play area alongside him. And with Buck now by his side, Rocket's forced to submit to Caesar and accept him as the new alpha. Shifting focus back to Will now, who one night decides to prepare a dose of the new ALZ-113 for his father, but Charles gently refuses the treatment, so Will instead just falls asleep beside him, and upon awaking the next morning, he finds that his father had passed away. On top of the loss of his father, Will also soon finds himself at odds with Jacobs at work, who's authorized more 113 trials despite Will ordering them to wait until Koba's blood work was analyzed so they can understand the human-related effects, as he told Franklin. But strangely, Franklin hasn't been to work in 2 days. And Jacob still doesn't plan on stopping the trials anyway, so Will quits. We soon see why Franklin's been out of work though, as he arrives outside of Will's home, desperate to inform him of something. But he's not there, and Franklin instead runs into and is startled by Doug, who he then accidentally sneezes blood on before rushing off. And the next time we see Franklin, days later, he's found dead in his apartment. Frustrated and distraught, Will decides to head back to the sanctuary and successfully bribes John into letting him take Caesar home. But to his shock, Caesar appears to no longer want to leave, as he refuses to speak to Will or exit his cage. So Will has no choice but to leave him. That evening, Caesar begins his new mission to bring the apes together as their leader. And after recognizing this may be difficult due to how quickly they jump to violence with one another, he manages to sneak out of the shelter that night and back to Will's home, although only to steal multiple canisters of ALZ-113, which he then brings back with him and unleashes onto the other apes, increasing their intelligence as it had for him and Koba. With the apes all now much wiser, Caesar puts together a final plan for them all to escape the facility together, beginning by turning his attention on Dodge, who he manages to lure into the play area alongside him after not returning to his cage so that he can then overpower him and grab hold of his cattle prod, which he does while defiantly speaking his first words. No! And with Dodge knocked out, Caesar's able to release the rest of the apes from their cages, who immediately intercept Dodge's brother Rodney attempting to leave and attack him, although they're quickly stopped by Caesar, who, since Rodney had been kind to them, chooses to just lock him in a cage instead. Meanwhile, Dodge soon regains consciousness, as well as a possession of his cattle prod, and prepares to attack Caesar, so the latter aims and fires a water hose at him, resulting in the former being electrocuted to death. And although shooken upon his first murder, Caesar still continues moving forward with his plan, leading all the apes through the city to the Redwoods. On their way, they also travel through Genesis and the San Francisco Zoo to free all the apes being held there as well, including Koba, while Jacobs manages to avoid being killed by the apes thanks to the arrival of a police helicopter, on which he explains that if they want to stop the apes, they must kill their leader. Despite police setting up a blockade on the Golden Gate Bridge, they fail to take many of the apes down as they battle their way through them, and they also ultimately fail in their attempt to kill Caesar from the aforementioned helicopter thanks to Buck pushing him out of the line of fire, leaping into the helicopter and sending it crashing onto the bridge, all the while taking on enough gunfire to sadly kill him. Buck's attack didn't end up killing Jacobs though, so he begs for Caesar to help him. But Caesar instead leaves his fate up to Koba, who sends him crashing into the water below to his death, before the apes then finally make it to the Redwoods. Although only for Caesar to be suddenly met by Will, who began following after him shortly after the apes escaped from the shelter, and he takes this time to apologize to Caesar for everything he's put him through, as well as try to convince him to come home. But Caesar claims the Redwoods are his home, a bittersweet revelation that Will's forced to accept, and so he urges Caesar to go off with the rest of the apes. Sometime later, we meet back up with Douglas Hunsaker as he arrives at the airport where he works as a pilot, and we see as he passes through, a drop of blood falls from his nose, a sign of the beginning of the rapid spread of what would become known as the simian flu. Over the next 10 years, it becomes evident that the disease is not only highly contagious, but also incredibly deadly, ultimately resulting in presumably the entire human population dying off, although not before any signs of civilian order collapsed, as those who were not directly killed by the virus ended up dying anyway in the fighting. Caesar and the rest of the apes, though, managed to avoid much loss over the course of these 10 years behind his leadership, and they've actually been able to birth a whole new generation of apes, including Caesar and his wife Cornelia's sons, Blue Eyes and Cornelius. Also among this new generation is Rocket's son and Blue Eyes' best friend, Ash, who Blue Eyes hangs out with in the woods before the two shockingly encounter a human named Carver, who in a panic suddenly shoots Ash in the shoulder, drawing the attention of the rest of Carver's group, made up of Malcolm, Malcolm's son Alexander, Malcolm's partner Ellie, Foster, and Kemp, as well as the rest of the apes, who surround the humans and await Caesar's command, and whom Malcolm recognizes are much smarter than any apes he's ever seen. So he orders his group to drop their weapons, and once they do, Caesar shouts at them to go. As they leave though, Caesar also sends Koba and a couple others to follow them and find their home base, which is revealed to be a large community within San Francisco, populated by humans immune to the virus. And now knowing where they live, Koba proposes they attack first while they least expect it. But Caesar claims that if they go to war, they could lose everything they've built. and so instead, he leads the apes into the city the following day and announces to its people, although they don't want a war, they're prepared to fight if necessary, and orders them not to re-enter their home. The humans may not have any other choice though, as we learn through a conversation between Malcolm and the city's mayor Dreyfus that the reason they'd entered the woods in the first place was to locate a nearby dam that they believed could power the city, which is about 2 weeks away from running out of fuel. So Malcolm, not wanting to lose what little he has left, prepares to head back out and hopes he can make Caesar see reason. And Dreyfus informs him that, if he's not back in 2 days, he plans on gathering all the firepower they have to kill every last one of them. Also joining Malcolm on his mission is the rest of the group that had encountered the apes earlier, although he has them stay in their vehicles while he enters the woods, in which he's promptly surrounded by a group of gorillas led by one named Luca, who drag him before Caesar, to whom Malcolm explains their current situation and asks if they could have a couple days to work on the dam, and Caesar agrees on the condition that they turn over whatever guns they have on them to be destroyed. Koba, though, is furious with Caesar's decision, claiming that giving the humans more power will just make them more dangerous. But Caesar believes they're desperate, and so if he made them go, they'd likely just return and attack them anyway. Still, Koba doesn't trust the humans, so he, along with the other 2 apes he'd gone with earlier, heads back to the city once again, and there, he discovers that the humans are in possession of enough guns to kill them all. As he makes the journey back to their village, Malcolm, Foster, Kemp, and Carver begin clearing some blockage within the dam, although while doing so, they end up trapping themselves beneath debris. But fortunately, the apes arrive and help free them. As Malcolm thanks Caesar for their help, his son Cornelius hangs around Ellie, Alexander, and Carver, and it appears for a moment that the apes and humans may be close to forming a peaceful bond with one another, or at least that's until Cornelius stumbles upon Carver's hidden gun within his briefcase, prompting Carver to attempt an attack against the newborn, which then prompts Blue Eyes to step in before he's held at gunpoint by Carver, although not for long as he's swiftly taken down and disarmed by Caesar, who demands they all leave now. Adding to Caesar's frustration is the current state of his wife's health, who we've seen has been sick for quite some time, and Ellie and Malcolm soon become aware of her condition as well after following Caesar back to his home, leading Ellie to offer them some medicine in hopes of helping her. And this act of kindness convinces Caesar to allow them one more day to work on the dam with the apes' help, although Carver is forced to stay behind in the car. It isn't until the next day that Koba finally makes it back to the village, and he's even more irate upon learning Caesar is now helping the humans with their work. So he confronts him about this, claiming he loves humans more than his own kind, or even his own children, which prompts Caesar to suddenly attack and nearly strangle Koba to death, but he ultimately releases his grip. Seemingly realizing he'd gone too far, Koba asks for Caesar's forgiveness before running off in embarrassment, and the humans then return to their work on the dam, which by the end of the night, works empowering the city. So Caesar brings the humans back with him into his village to celebrate, and during the celebration, we see Cornelia has made a full recovery. But the good times don't last very long, as Caesar soon notices Koba below them wielding a gun, which we saw him steal from the humans' armory earlier before returning and killing Carver, in which he now suddenly aims and fires at Caesar, sending him falling down into the woods, while managing to avoid being seen by the others and leaving only the gun behind. This allows him to blame Caesar's murder on the humans and take full command of the apes, who he prepares for an attack against the city, while Malcolm, Ellie, and Alexander are fortunately able to avoid the apes' wrath thanks to Maurice helping them escape. Meanwhile, back in the city, the humans are in the midst of celebrating their newfound power, which they're also seen attempting to use to try and get in contact with others from the outside world, although their attempt and celebration is now put on hold by the arrival of Koba and the apes, who he leads in attacking and raiding the humans' armory, before unleashing an attack on the gate. Despite Dreyfus and his army's efforts to keep the apes from entering the city, it's ultimately overrun, with Koba having the apes track down and imprison every human in sight, as well as kill a few of them, as he orders Ash to do. However, he refuses, claiming this isn't what Caesar would have wanted. So Koba kills Ash instead, proclaiming he leads the apes now. In addition to imprisoning the humans, Koba orders for Caesar's most loyal followers to be locked up as well, including the likes of Maurice and Rocket, saddening Blue Eyes. But Maurice urges him to protect himself, and so he continues on following Koba's commands. Shifting our focus back to within the woods now, as we meet back up with Malcolm, Ellie, and Alexander, who fortunately end up coming across the still alive but severely wounded Caesar, who after being carried back to their truck, reveals that it wasn't their kind that attempted to kill him, but Koba. With no medical supplies left on them, the group decides to take him back to the city, and he asks that they stop at a specific house, with that house being the Rodman home, still filled with the framed photographs of Caesar and Will. In order to patch him up though, they still need to retrieve Ellie's surgical kit from their home, so Malcolm does so alone, but although successfully collecting the kit, he's found just as he's about to leave by Blue Eyes, who thankfully doesn't look to harm him and instead just prepares to walk away, before Malcolm reveals that his father is still alive, prompting him to follow him back to the Rodman home for them to be reunited. With the kit, Ellie's able to perform a successful surgery on Caesar, who while recovering, forms a plan with his son to turn the apes against Koba, beginning with Blue Eyes returning to the city that night to free Maurice, Rocket, and Caesar's other loyalists and reunite them with him, before the group is then led by Malcolm underground to the location of the tower atop which Koba has settled. While traveling underground though, Malcolm's forced to split from the apes after coming across the still alive Dreyfus, who had escaped underground to avoid the apes' attack along with another of his soldiers named Finney and a radio operator named Werner. But we see that they haven't just been hiding down here, as Dreyfus reveals that they've actually planted a bunch of C4 beneath the tower with the intention of blowing it and the apes up, which Malcolm can't allow to happen, so he grabs hold of Finney's gun and aims it at the trio, hoping it'll buy Caesar some time. Caesar and his group of apes meanwhile have made the climb up to the top of the tower for him to confront Koba, which almost immediately results in a brawl between the two once again. And during the battle, Caesar, having taken a good bit of punishment himself, eventually manages to severely wound and repeatedly attacks Koba's abdomen. As they continue to fight, Malcolm's seen still trying to explain the truth behind the apes' actions to Dreyfus, who refuses to believe they're anything but animals and claims that, even if Malcolm were to stop him from setting off the bombs, they'd already managed to contact a military base up north over the radio, who are on their way right now, a claim that Werner confirms as well, before Dreyfus then suddenly grabs the device to set off the bombs, and believing he's saving the human race, he unleashes a huge explosion that kills him, Werner, and Finney, as well as takes down the tower, while Malcolm manages to leap out of harm's way. The explosion sends Caesar, Koba, and the rest of the apes tumbling towards the ground, with some being killed in the process, but fortunately, a majority of them appear to have survived. Unfortunately though, Koba manages to get hold of and begins firing a gun at the other apes, with one bullet even hitting Maurice, prompting Caesar to attack him once again and nearly send him falling all the way to the ground below. But Koba manages to hold on and reaches out for Caesar to save him, reciting his claim that apes don't kill apes. But despite this, Caesar, seeing all the damage Koba has caused, chooses to let him fall to his death instead. Shortly after ridding of Koba, Caesar reunites with Malcolm, who informs him that military forces are on their way. So Caesar tells him to leave before the fighting starts, believing he has no choice but to fight now, aware the humans won't forgive them for starting this war. And after sharing a touching embrace, Malcolm leaves him to prepare the rest of the apes for war. We're then taken forward 2 years, which Caesar's army has mostly spent battling against and evading capture from ruthless Special Forces Colonel J. Wesley McCulloch's hardened battalion, the Alpha Omega, dispatched to exterminate the apes. Also during the last 2 years, unfortunately, some of the apes who'd been loyal to Koba, fearful of what Caesar may do to them, chose to join the side of the colonel on the promise that he'd spare their lives when the war was over, and whom his forces now called donkeys. We see these donkeys now as they help aid the colonel's army in launching an attack against the apes' trench. But despite striking first, it's actually the apes who come out on top of this exchange, as they kill nearly the humans' entire unit, outside of 4 soldiers and a donkey named Red, while also losing 63 of their own in the fight. The 5 survivors are then dragged into the apes' trench and brought before Caesar, flanked by Maurice, Luca, and an albino gorilla named Winter, and he seeks to use this opportunity to make peace, explaining to the humans that he'd already killed the ape that started this war, and now only fights to protect his kind, before ultimately deciding to set the soldiers free with a message for the colonel.
Leave us the woods, and the killing can't stop.
He doesn't free Red along with them though, as he's instead taken away by Winter, who doesn't do too great of a job keeping him contained, as he soon returns with a gash in his head, claiming the traitor had attacked him and escaped. Shortly thereafter, the group is reunited with Blue Eyes and Rocket, returning from a long journey in search of a safe haven for the apes, which they believe they found, as Blue Eyes reveals they discovered a desert beyond the mountains that could serve as their new home. Winter, frightened by their previous battle and Red's attack, suggests they leave tonight, but Blue Eyes, his romantic partner Lake, and Caesar claim it would be impossible to move them all by tonight, and they first must find a safe way out of the woods. That night though, Winter's fears are proven justified as Caesar notices soldiers attempting to sneak their way into the cave. So he goes to round up the other guards, but unfortunately, he's unable to prevent an attack, as he soon finds that both Cornelia and Blue Eyes have been shockingly killed by the colonel himself, who then attempts to kill Caesar as well, but is ultimately forced to escape via helicopter by the rest of his army. After mourning the loss, the apes quickly prepare to leave their hideout and journey to the desert Blue Eyes and Rocket had discovered, although Caesar doesn't plan on joining them, instead leaving Cornelius to be looked after by Lake and preparing for his own mission to find and kill the colonel. Despite ordering that none of them join him, Maurice, Rocket, and Luca, after failing to convince him to stay, decide to journey alongside him, refusing to let him go alone, and so, together they begin their hunt for the colonel, which is quickly interrupted when they come across a random man who Caesar's almost immediately forced to gun down and kill when the man reaches for his own gun. And unfortunately, shortly following the man's murder, the group then finds he'd also had a daughter, who strangely appears unable to speak, and who, despite Caesar insisting they can't take her with them, Maurice decides to bring along for their journey, unwilling to leave her all on her own. As they continue their journey, they eventually come across an Alpha Omega base, where it's revealed that Winter has betrayed them, as upon confronting Winter within the base, they learn that he'd actually fabricated Red's escape earlier, after Red promised the colonel would spare his life in exchange for Caesar's location. Winter appears heartbroken that his actions ultimately resulted in Blue Eyes and Cornelia's deaths though, before their confrontation is suddenly interrupted by the sounds of guards nearby, who Winter attempts to gain the attention of, forcing the four to grab hold of him and for Caesar to strangle him to death. For the rest of the night, the group remains camped out in the woods before heading off again the next morning to follow after the soldiers as they leave their base, although their pursuit is eventually put on hold when they hear the sudden sounds of gunfire, which they come to learn was the result of the colonel's army killing 3 of their own men, one of whom is still alive when the apes find him, although, like the young girl, he appears unable to speak as well, and with him slowly and painfully dying from his wounds, Caesar decides to just put him out of his misery. As they attempt to relocate where the remaining soldiers had gone, the four's attention is once again forced elsewhere by someone attempting to steal one of their guns and horses, so they chase them down and learn that they're actually another ape, although not one they've ever encountered before. He's revealed to be one of the few apes we've met thus far capable of speech, which he claims to have learned, along with his name Bad Ape, from the humans during his time in the Sierra Zoo, before the humans got sick and the apes got smart, resulting in every other ape in the zoo being killed while he managed to escape, eventually finding himself at the California border quarantine facility, from which he'd managed to recover food, and where he'd also witnessed human soldiers killing other sick humans until they all got sick and died as well. Caesar and the others believe this quarantine facility may be where the colonel and his soldiers had gone, so they ask Bad Ape to take them there. And although initially refusing out of fear of what could happen, after learning that a soldier had killed Caesar's son, which brings forth the memory of his own son being taken from him, he agrees to help. So the four make their way to the camp and begin scoping out the place from afar, until they're suddenly attacked by a couple of soldiers who'd been nearby, both of whom are quickly incapacitated. Although, in the process, Luca ends up getting stabbed through the chest with one of the soldiers' bayonet rifles, which sadly results in his death. This causes Maurice to rethink whether this mission is really worth it, comparing Caesar's quest for revenge to that of Koba's. But this just convinces Caesar that bringing them along was a mistake, and so he orders them to head back to the desert. Now on his own, Caesar makes it just about all the way to camp, where he stumbles upon a number of his own apes tied to wood planks, and from above, he sees that his entire colony has been captured by the humans, before Caesar's then also knocked out and captured by Red. Immediately on his first day as one of the colonel's prisoners, Caesar and the other apes are put to work, being forced to build a wall despite not having eaten or drank anything since their capture. And Caesar also notices something off about this wall they're building, as some of the colonel's soldiers are seen outside of it preparing for battle. The building process soon takes an unfortunate turn though, when one of the apes makes a significant error, prompting the colonel to have said ape repeatedly whipped by Red, until he's stopped by Caesar, who offers himself up to take the punishment instead. In addition to the whipping, Caesar's also tied up onto a wood plank for the remainder of the night, during which he's taken down momentarily to be brought before the colonel, who threatens to kill the apes one by one if he interferes with the construction again. But Caesar claims they soon won't be able to work anyways without being given food or water. Caesar also takes this opportunity to point out the men he saw preparing for battle, and questions if a war is coming. So the Colonel explains that 10 months ago, during his search for the Apes base, his own son had strangely just stopped speaking, and as the Colonel describes, had become primitive like an animal. Then soon after, a few other soldiers stopped speaking as well, leading their medic to discover that the virus that every human survivor still carries had suddenly mutated, and that if this mutated virus were to spread, it could destroy humanity for good this time, robbing them of the things that make them human, such as their speech and higher thinking. So McCulloch realized that if he wanted to save humanity, he'd have to kill his only son, and so he did, before ordering for the other infected to be killed as well as those who questioned his judgment. Some managed to escape into the woods though, with some fleeing to his superiors up north, who tried convincing him that this plague could be dealt with medically. But he refused to make the same mistakes they did in the past, and instead delivered them a message, stating that if they wanted to relieve him of his command, they'd have to come here and do it themselves. Needing this wall to be built though, the Colonel agrees to feed the apes the following morning, although not Caesar, who's once again left strung up on the wood plank until finally being freed that night and locked away in his own separate cell. Throughout all this, we see that Maurice, Rocket, Bad Ape, and the little girl had in fact not gone back to the desert, and have instead been searching for a way to free Caesar and the others, which they luckily soon managed to stumble upon in the form of an underground tunnel. Although as they're looking through the tunnel, they end up momentarily losing sight of the little girl, who manages to sneak her way up into the base into Caesar's cage, who, recognizing he's nearly on the brink of death, she feeds a nearby bucket of water and some food the other apes had saved for him, helping him survive the night. The young girl also gifts him a stuffed doll she'd been carrying with her, before being forced to run and hide by the arrival of the Colonel's soldiers, who fortunately fail to spot her thanks to a distraction from Rocket, who allows himself to be captured instead alongside the others, so they can kickstart their plan of escape. Before they can all escape down to the tunnel though, they'll first need to free the children above ground, since the tunnel's path only leads beneath the adult ape's cage. So the following night, Rocket draws one of the soldiers' attention by throwing his feces at him, which prompts the man to enter the cage and hold Rocket at gunpoint, in turn allowing Maurice to yank him underground and knock him out. And now in possession of the man's gun and keys, Rocket and Caesar are able to sneak their way over to the children's cage, where Caesar's able to finally reunite with his son, before transferring them over to the adult's cage so they can all enter the tunnel. Caesar once again though doesn't plan on joining them on their journey, as he's still unable to accept his hate and feels that he must kill the Colonel. So he instead makes his way up to his room as he sleeps and finds a gun laid beside him, which he promptly picks up and aims at the Colonel's head. Although just as he's about to pull the trigger, he notices that the Colonel appears unable to speak, and it turns out he's actually contracted the mutated virus, spread to him from the young girl after he'd found her doll left for Caesar within his cage earlier. The Colonel then presses the gun against his own skull, seemingly begging Caesar to kill him, but Caesar ultimately refuses, instead leaving the gun for the Colonel to take his own life, which he does. The apes' escape, meanwhile, hasn't gone at all as well as they'd planned, thanks to the sudden arrival of the soldiers from the north, and them immediately launching an attack against the Alpha Omega's camp, resulting in a huge battle that unfortunately draws the attention of the Colonel's soldiers onto the apes, who immediately open fire at and kill many of them. Red ends up getting a front row seat to the massacre of his own kind, and it appears to actually leave him a bit shaken up, but he continues following the soldiers' orders to protect himself, or at least that's until he notices Caesar running behind them and straight towards a large fuel tank with a grenade in hand, which he's unfortunately prevented from throwing by one of the Colonel's most loyal soldiers, Preacher, known for having an incredibly accurate shot, as seen now as he fires a bow straight into Caesar's side. Thankfully though, before he can land another fatal blow, he's suddenly blown to bits by Red with a grenade launcher, which immediately results in him being killed as well by another soldier, as Caesar once again grabs hold of the grenade and launches it straight into the fuel tank, blowing up their entire camp and every human inside. There isn't much time for the apes or the North soldiers to celebrate this victory though, as the explosion is then quickly followed by a massive avalanche, which completely engulfs the North's entire army, while the apes are fortunately able to survive by climbing up the trees. So with each of their human foes entirely wiped out, Caesar leads his colony to their new home over the desert, where they're finally able to live at peace once again. Although sadly, it seems Caesar won't be able to experience that with them past this point, as Maurice discovers that Caesar's lost too much blood to survive much longer. With his death imminent, Maurice makes Caesar a promise that Cornelius will know who his father was and what he did for them, before Caesar slowly and silently succumbs to his wounds and dies a peaceful death. And that was everything you needed to know before Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also let us know in the comments below which of the 3 Planet of the Apes films covered in this video was your favorite. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.